Thank you all. It is time to move into our second session. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Karen Wolf. Karen is the professor of history at Brown and the Beatrice and Julio Mario Santo Domingo director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library. She has also famously served as the executive director of the Omohundro Institute. Karen's work, ranging from her first book, Not All Wives, which was on women in colonial Philadelphia, to her forthcoming Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in 18th Century British America, have expanded and enriched our understanding of family and gender in the long 18th century. But more than that, Karen's innovative work at the OI and as a public intellectual more generally have given us an American past that is really and truly vast. And Karen understands better than anyone I've ever met that the grand narratives we tell about that past depend upon the mechanics of archives, publishing, and editing, mechanics that are often hidden from the public, but that I look forward to exploring with her today. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Kathy. That is very nice. I wrote a very short introduction and bio for myself, and obviously you did not read that one. It was very generous of you. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to celebrate Barbara and the things that she has cared about and worked so hard to bring into being. I'm going to say just a few things, and then I'm going to introduce our distinguished and wonderful panel, and then they will share some remarkably thoughtful ideas and give us a lot to talk about, I hope. So I think about this panel as Infrastructure Week. You may remember Infrastructure Week was a painful, long experience a couple of years ago when it seemed like we could never get people to pay attention to the things that really mattered every single day, like public health, for example, and bridges, and schools, and paying teachers. That is, all of the things that bind us together and make it possible for us to all function communally. All the things that actually support the interdependence that we know is the heart of every human endeavor. So the title of this session is Documentary Editing, but I'd like to revise that in the grand scholarly tradition of revising and say that this session really is about infrastructure. It's about the ways in which we should all be thinking about, and I know we are actually, especially given the comments from the last panel, but be thinking about all the ways in which our work depends on creating and supporting institutions and projects, including those like libraries and archives and documentary editing projects that bring sources to life and to light. The infrastructure of early America, which Barbara has devoted herself to, includes critical institutions like the APS and the OI, to critical scholarly editions, including famously the famous Franklin and the famous Jefferson, and I'm excited that we're going to hear about some somewhat less famous dudes today too, from courtesy of our panel, that make the advancement of advancing knowledge possible. Documentary editing has played a key role in early American history for a very, very long time. That is, since George Washington packed up his trunks and said to somebody, I forget, someone here knows who he said this to. Is it Tobias Lear? I don't know. Said, make sure my papers are protected. Documentary editing has sat at the heart of how we tell that grand narrative and how we're untelling that grand narrative. It is, in fact, the fantastic Washington papers, now 55 years old, I think, that has made it possible for school teachers all across the country to tell the story of Ona Judge, which Erica Armstrong Dunbar so brilliantly illuminated, and which students everywhere can link freely through the papers, the Washington papers that are accessible through Founders Online, funded through the National Archives and the NEH and others. I was recently, well, actually I'm always browsing in the library where I work now, but I was recently browsing in the reference stacks, and I was thinking about documentary editing, and I pulled off the first volume of the naval documents of the American Revolution, as one does. This first volume was published in 1964, and the foreword to that volume was written in the summer of 1963 by the then President John F. Kennedy, just a few months before his assassination. And Kennedy wrote, and I'm sorry I don't have the exact quote here, but Kennedy wrote so movingly about how and why it was so important to recover and to share and to make accessible these materials about the revolution. Because a nation without its history is no nation at all, and a people without its history have no communal sense of themselves as a people. Now, I think we could ask a lot of questions about the nature of the community and the nature of the people that he was referring to when he was thinking that the naval documents of the American Revolution, a Navy man himself, of course, would reveal. But nonetheless, his commitment to that, I think, was striking. The other thing that I think was striking there is that Kennedy very explicitly noted that this important project was kicking off in anticipation of 1976. So here we are, it's 2023, and we're talking about 2026, which is just 3 years away. But you know, Kennedy was thinking in terms of the long game. And I think that's, to bring this back, I think that's what infrastructure projects do. Think about the long game. Think about how we can pay it forward, how we can future cast. What are the things that we have done for ourselves as a sort of community of knowledge, and what are the things that we will do. I'm so constantly impressed by documentary editors and librarians and archivists, all of whom have specialized technical training, none of which I have, but I get to hang out with them and learn from them all the time, as we all do. I think the most important thing I've learned in my time spent with documentary editors and librarians and archivists is just how important it is to surface the interconnections of our work. So the conversations we were having in that first session, I hope will loop back here in really explicit ways to the conversation in this panel. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our three distinguished panelists, beginning, I'm going to go from right to left here because that's the order they're listed here and the order in which I believe they will speak. First is Aaron Holmes. Dr. Aaron Holmes is a historian of early America, slavery, and the built environment, in addition to being a public historian specializing in historic preservation and museum studies. She has been at the University of Missouri for the past 4 years, first as a Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy postdoc in political history, and this past year as a visiting assistant professor of public history. Dr. Holmes holds a BA in history from the Great College of William and Mary, a certificate in early American history and museum studies from the National Institute of American History and Democracy, also at William and Mary, a PhD in history from the University of South Carolina, and a certificate in historical archaeology and cultural resource management from the USC Department of Anthropology. Her manuscript on the House That Slavery Built, Social and Material Transformation in the British Atlantic World, 1670 to 1831, explores how the built environment, buildings, landscapes, objects, and the spaces in between shaped the experience of slavery within the plantation house, transforming colonial identity to create the conditions that made the American Revolution possible. Her research has been funded by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon, among others. And from 2017 to 19, she was an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation postdoc curatorial fellow right here at the APS, where she was lead curator for Mapping a Nation, Shaping the Early American Republic. Next, we'll hear from Jim McClure. Jim joined the Papers of Thomas Jefferson editorial project at Princeton in 1996 and has been general editor and project director since 2014. Prior to joining the Jefferson Papers, he worked on editions of the papers of the 19th century American political figure Salmon Chase and the sculptor Daniel Chester French. He is former president of the Association for Documentary Editing and has a doctorate in history from the University of Michigan, a master's degree from the College of William and Mary. I did not organize this part, I promise you. And a bachelor's degree with a double major in history and political science from Utah State. Bayard Miller is the Associate Director of Research, Engagement, and Technology at the APS. And he's worked with APS digital collections and managed major digitization and digital humanities projects for over 10 years. Since 2017, he has run the Library and Museum Center for Digital Scholarship, and he is a certified archivist and holds an MA in Public History from Temple University. Will you join me in welcoming our panel?
Speak up here, just grab your clicker. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen, for that generous introduction. I'm so excited to be back here at the APS, and if you will indulge me, I am going to, never mind. I was going to set a timer because I notoriously run long, if not given signals. I want to thank, too, Dr. Christina Poznań, who is the managing editor of the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation with Enslaved.org, who co-wrote my comments with me. She was originally going to be here as well. But I'm excited to sort of share our conversation about documentary editing, or data sets as documentary editing, as well as some of my own work. So I wanted to start by talking about how is and isn't a data set an edited scholarly document. On the one hand, there's the transcription of historical documents, which is pretty straightforward when it's in tabular form. It maintains the original fields, it's a verbatim transcription of content, and it captures things in roughly the original form. But when it becomes documentary editing is with the production of enhanced data sets. These are a major step removed from the original source, which makes it fundamentally more useful for other researchers and blurs the line between the original source and inferred content. Text in these data sets is often normalized, so changing abbreviations to full words, standardizing spelling, etc. Some fields become controlled fields instead of variable ones, and limit the options available to you as you're putting them in. Imputed fields, this seems to be the biggest change from going from transcription to enhanced fields, and it's something that I think a lot of us in creating data sets do without really thinking about it as we extract information from these records that we begin to observe and then create new fields in these data sets, these documents. The metadata and data dictionaries that accompany these data sets also contribute to the transformation of these data sets from mere transcription into documentary edition, because they provide a degree of transparency about the methodologies that produce the data sets that is otherwise lost in a simple transcription. Publication through repositories like the Harvard Dataverse or the Magazine of Early American Data Sets or the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation preserve a transcription as well as the enhanced data set, providing, again, that degree of transparency and allowing scholars to conduct their own research with these materials, making them more accessible. Oftentimes, these data sets are accompanied by articles published in these journals that provide further understandings of the context in which they were produced. Preservation of historical data sets to this point has often been somewhat incidental. I'm sure many of us have somewhere on our laptops or in a file folder a list of names and dates and things that we needed to collect but did not have a suitable platform to publish. And so by publishing these data sets, they become more accessible and navigable to a wider range of users, enhancing the applications of that research, which I think goes back to some of the innovations that Barbara Oberg accomplished with her scholarly editions. Having these resources available makes a significant difference, and particularly to scholars and members of the public who are interested in doing research but lack university affiliations. Those early scholarly volumes and open access databases were particularly important and are something that have sadly gone by the wayside. Preservation and publication of these data sets also allows us to go back and reconsider the work of earlier scholars. For myself, I wanted to better understand Richard Dunn's argument in Sugar and Slaves, and I had his numbers from his work on the 1680 census, but in retranscribing it myself, I had a better understanding of the layout of the plantation regime in Barbados. He focused on the fact that 7 individuals owned more than 50% of the land and more than 50% of the enslaved people in Barbados, which somewhat skews our understanding of how these landscapes were broken up and who exactly was participating in the economy of slavery. 7 people doesn't sound like a lot until you consider that the other 50% of the land was owned by a large number, many of whom still own significant numbers of enslaved people, and that Barbados is roughly the size of Fairfax County, Virginia, if you need a reference point. And so it's not a question of just a couple people owning the entire island, but having major influence nonetheless. My particular contribution to these comments comes in the form of my work on what you see behind me. This is the 1817 Register of Enslaved People in Former British Colonies. These were produced as part of the process of amelioration and emancipation in the British Caribbean. Beginning in 1817, every 3 years, data was collected from these plantations, identifying the people who were enslaved on each plantation, on each island, as a way of having a better understanding of the demographics. The folios that they produced, what you see up here, each folio is 2 pages, produced about 1,200 folios, so double that number of pages, and averages about 70 names per folio. In 2018, an article, I came to this transcription in 2013 as I started doing my research and quickly realized what a rich data source this was, but also that my dissertation director might murder me if I attempted to make him wait for a transcription of the whole thing. So I was forced to spend time identifying particular plantations that I was researching and focus on transcribing those in the meantime. During my free time while I was an APS postdoc, I decided that I would go back and try to begin the transcription of the whole thing, which was incredibly time-consuming and still did not progress very far. This is one of those moments when COVID was a good thing, because instead of being able to travel to conferences, I was able to hire an undergraduate research assistant, Bailey Martin, at the University of Missouri, who has made huge amounts of progress in transcribing these. These came to the attention of the public in 2018 with a Guardian article by Chris Manjapra, who wrote The Black Ghost of Empire, which I highly recommend. And he called attention to the fact that these registers were produced as part of the process of ending slavery, but they were produced for the benefit of slaveholders. And he was following up on a tweet in 2018 that alerted the British public to the fact that the British government had only finished paying off reparations to slaveholders in 2015. So anyone who had paid taxes up to that point had contributed to ending slavery, which is how their tweet framed it, and then all the tweets that reacted to it got very angry because that money went to slaveholders, which is a good reason to get angry. Previous efforts at transcribing these registers focused on extracting summarized data. So the Legacies of British Slavery project has numbers, has numeric summaries for the populations on individual plantations, while a deeper analysis by B.W. Higman pulls out particular occupations, which you can see the categories are occupations, age, they say color. This seems to be limited primarily to Black or mixed race. But he also was able to summarize the numbers, the data for occupations. However, again, this was a huge amount of work, and so he only focused on collecting the data from 3 of these parishes in Barbados. And so why didn't I just do what they did and produce these summaries? At the end of the day, I am a scholar of early American slavery, and so much of the study of slavery has focused on how enslaved people's humanity had been erased by relying on documentation by slaveholders, the process of creating archives and databases, and historians themselves. By transcribing the entirety of the source, individuals' names are linked directly to their ages, and I'm going to go to the less pretty picture, which is this one. Individuals can be linked to their... I think it's got a kind of beauty, but I do like the older records. I don't know if I'd put it on an iPhone cover case. Individuals' names are directly linked to their ages. Limited descriptions of coloring, descriptions of occupations, and places of birth can be thereby connected to the particular individual. And particularly important, I think, as well, individual enslavers can be more directly implicated for their involvement in slavery. And the use of titles offers opportunities to enhance the data set and later consider the gender breakdown of slaveholders, where they were, how many were relying on attorneys to manage their enslaved populations. And it becomes easier to identify family groups, as well as the way that certain positions and skills could be passed from one member of the same family to the other, which was what had originally interested me in the data set. At the end of the day, I think the most important thing about going forward is making these documents and data sets more accessible to the public. The data set that I used originally, the pretty document, or the prettier document, at least visually, is behind a paywall on Ancestry.org. And to even just search in it, you have to pay for a membership, which not everyone can do. And particularly when we're considering the descendants of formerly enslaved people, this seems like an inequality to address. So I will end there, but thank you so much for having me.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself. All right. Okay, so as a tribute to Barbara's importance, I think, and also to the importance of infrastructure, to follow Karen's theme, I'll just point out that present here in the audience, there are, besides me, 8 present or former members of the staff of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson who are here. Their name tags don't identify that they're affiliated with the Jefferson Papers, but somehow through the course of the day, maybe you can kind of figure out who they are and can talk to them. And actually, the other active member of the Jefferson Papers staff couldn't be here because she's in New England, but my understanding is she's with us virtually. So if there's a celebration of Barbara Oberg, we all show up. My affiliation's with the Jefferson Papers, but I'm actually not going to talk a lot about the Jefferson Papers or the Franklin Papers because I know later on in the course of the day there'll be discussion of that. What actually I'm going to emphasize a little bit more, well, I'm going to talk a good bit about the current situation in terms of documentary editing per se, but also try to bring in a little bit of the other projects that Barbara was affiliated with in her career, which is Filippo Mazzei and Albert Gallatin, for reasons that I'll get to as we go along here. Because I think in terms of where documentary editing is now and where it's going to be going, those kinds of projects are a little more informative than the big flagship projects like Jefferson and Franklin, because you are never again going to see anything like the Papers of Thomas Jefferson or the Franklin Papers or the Washington Papers. It's just not going to happen. So we need to be thinking in terms of other things that are additions, particularly in terms of what people might be starting off now. And this is, the reasons for that have to do with resources. One resource is time, and just the amount of time it takes to do a big comprehensive edition. That time being magnified many times over what was originally thought it would be for those projects. And I'll go ahead, we don't usually talk about this out loud that much, but the Jefferson Papers was originally conceived with the feasibility study in 1943, so 80 years ago. It got started very quickly after that feasibility study in January 1944, but we're 80 years in on the venture, and we still have a ways to go to finish it up. In terms of documentary editing, if somebody wants to sort of start a documentary editing project per se right now, and wants to think about how do you provide that infrastructure for your infrastructure project. One of the longstanding sources of federal funding for documentary editing projects is the National Historical Publications to Records Commission, NHPRC. And in there, they have different programs, some of which actually fund archival projects, others of which traditionally there was two divisions or two parts of it. One was archival and one was editing. It's a little more complicated than that now, but in there, the publishing historical records and collaborative digital editions, that's the current grant program for the NHPRC. They currently have a cap on grants of $125,000 per year. And it's up to $125,000. If you're in the current application cycle, it's probably not certain that you would get, if you've applied for $125,000, you'll get $125,000. And the cap, we can expect to come down. It's going to be, before too long, that cap will be $100,000. And you might think, oh, $100,000, I can like fund a position. Well, no, you can't really, because the position's going to cost you, depending on your institution, you're going to have to also pay benefits, and the benefits are going to run 25%, 30%, something like that. You have to take that out. And so, you know, you might be able to do a kind of junior position, depending on the cost of living where you are and whether you're paying somebody what they really do as a trained historian to be working on your project. But you might not be able to do even like one full junior position with a grant from the NHPRC. NHPRC grants are only for 1 year at a time. You can reapply, but you have to keep reapplying each year. There is now a 10-year limit for the funding. And again, it's like $125,000, $100,000. I can do a lot with that. I can do a lot with 10 years. Again, you have to think about it, sort of what is the project that you're envisioning and what's it going to take in the way of gearing up, what's it going to take to complete the thing. So 10 years can, you know, might be a limitation. The idea, of course, is to try to avoid having projects that go 80 years, that go 8 decades. It's also to kind of keep more circulation going of projects, because as long as you have Jefferson, Washington, et cetera, sort of absorbing funds that could go to other projects, that is a limitation on other projects being able to go forward. But for whatever reason, the 10-year cap is in there. Now, so just talking about for NHPRC funds, basically, if you have that kind of limitation on money and that kind of limitation on time, it means that you're going to go for low-hanging fruit in terms of what you can do. Now, that is not, low-hanging fruit can be very good fruit, okay? So we can't just dismiss that and say, well, you know, I mean, there's some very worthwhile stuff that can be done within the limitations, but that limitation is there. Now, the National Endowment for the Humanities is another funder of these kinds of projects. You can actually get up to 3 years worth of funding per grant for the endowment. They have a cap also in their scholarly editions and scholarly translations division. They have a cap. Currently, it's $100,000 for direct funds. You can ask for another $50,000 in matching funds. And so you can maybe get $150,000. Whether those caps will be maintained for long term, It's hard to say. Now, you can compensate to a certain degree now with applying for other programs. For example, you might be able to go for a digital humanities grant also from the NEH. But digital humanities grants, as Byard and I are finding out from the NEH, can be very, I mean, it's really, they're focusing in on technical issues and digital infrastructure again. And it's you know, it's the kind of thing, not everybody's going to be able, these things are all very competitive. Not everybody's going to be able to pick up a digital humanities grant to go along with a scholarly editions grant to fund what they want. Now, in the past, this is no longer as true as it used to be. In the past, one of the things that you got from the Jefferson and Franklin and projects like that was, in terms of federal funding overall, appropriations for NHPRC and NEH, those projects actually pulled a lot of smaller boats in their wake. That on Capitol Hill, Jefferson and Washington et al. Could like get some attention, and you could get there at the national scale, you could get some funding. You could get appropriations. You could help get appropriations for those, and then those appropriations would help other projects also. That's not the case so much anymore. In terms of non-federal funding, in addition to NEH, NHPRC, it's those resources are much sparser than people tend to think they're going to be. Now, one of the things that has changed is back in the day, in the 70s and 80s, when NHPRC and NEH money really sort of came in, the NHPRC required projects to be comprehensive. And if you couldn't do a comprehensive book edition, the idea was you'd do a microform edition that would be comprehensive, and then try to do a selected book edition in addition to that or after that. And that's where Philip Matzé and Albert Gallatin come in, because those were microforms, publications, those were editions. And that raised all kinds of questions that are still sort of with us in terms of, is that kind of an edition, is it really an edition? If it doesn't involve transcription, if it doesn't involve annotation, is that an edition? Is it ephemeral? At the time, those of us who worked on microfilm editions, our understanding was that these had a permanence. These were going to last forever. Microforms were going to last forever. That may be true. That doesn't mean that your library is going to make space for them forever. Fortunately, now what's happening is a lot of them are becoming digitized, and so you can get access to them that way. But I know at Princeton and lots of other places, you're not going to have that kind of space devoted for microforms, and nobody's doing microforms anymore. But a lot of the questions that came up with microform editions are now applying for digital. And one of the things that's come up is that there used to be this really solid divide, tried to be a solid divide between archives and editing. And what separated those? And those of us who are working on microforms editions, sometimes you get a little defensive, because it's like, well, how are you an editor? Isn't what you're doing is really just sort of a big compilation project? And we were like, no, we're doing all this apparatus. It's like annotation. It'll work. It kind of fits. There's less defensiveness now. There's more of an understanding that when you're talking about digital platforms, that the divide between an archive and a documentary edition may not be as strong. And Byard and I have worked on and continue to work on meteorological records projects, and this sort of comes up. The Jefferson Weather Records Project is a documentary edition. the larger North American Climate History Project that's going to be an aggregated, federated site that we're working on, would not itself meet the definition of a documentary edition, but some of its component parts could, it seems. But we can, that's one of the things we can talk about more. So I wanted to just sort of bring in Matsei, bring in Gallatin, bring in some of this whole idea. With that comprehensiveness, one of the things that's promoted today is we can get more diversity of projects. With that comprehensiveness, back when those comprehensive editions were started, back in the day, the NHPRC had a very long list of projects potentially to be editorial projects. And that list was very diverse, and a lot of projects got going. When I started in 1982, there were projects existing going for Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. In terms of women, there was Margaret Sanger, Jane Addams, and Emma Goldman. There were projects for these folks. There was soon, if it wasn't operating by then, there was a Black Abolitionist project. Because the idea of comprehensiveness, and the comprehensiveness included all of the projects that the NHPRC wanted to get going and the NEH wanted to get going. That comprehensiveness included a great diversity of projects. A lot of that got lost in between, and that has to do with politics and funding and things like that. So now what's happening when they talk about bringing diversity in, it's actually not new, it's actually coming back to what they were trying to do before.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Great. I'm going to show a bunch of slides because I'm a digital person. I'm going to show pretty things. I'm also going to take you on a whirlwind tour through a 7-year project. So good morning. I'm super honored to be here with all of you to celebrate the work and the life of Barbara Oberg. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm going to say we a lot in this presentation. By we, I'm referring to the Center for Digital Scholarship's Bethany Farrell and David Nelson. This project wouldn't have happened without their hard work and ingenuity. But I should really start by saying that I'm probably the least experienced documentary editor, both on this panel and in the room. And that's because I've never really actually done any documentary editing, at least not in the traditional sense. So whereas documentary editors focus on edited volumes, recreating context for which manuscripts are created, at the Center for Digital Scholarship, we are hyper-focused on creating computer-readable data sets from these very same documents. We sort of think that we fill a void, especially when it comes to handwritten structured data and loosely structured data. So while digitization and transcription have greatly enhanced access to collections, many records, even in their digital form, remain difficult to use. Lost my place. Great. And valuable data lay trapped within the confines of the page. Our Open Data Initiative attempts to free this data and publish it in a way that we hope allows scholars to interact with the source material in exciting new ways. I think the best example of this, and perhaps the most relevant to this panel, is the Philadelphia Ledgers Project. We started, I'm ahead of myself here, but we started this project way back in 2017, and it's actually partially inspired by this single quote. So, in 1961, the editors of the Franklin Papers deemed these records individually of no historical importance. It's a strong statement, but one that I kind of agree with, because if you look at these records, as you can see here, in their original form, this is difficult data, and I would say actually nearly impossible to use for any researcher. It would take years and years and years to crunch these numbers. But, as we all know, advances in computing technology have dramatically altered the scholarly information landscape in a way that no one, including the esteemed editors of the papers of Benjamin Franklin, could have fully anticipated. So we, as a team, set out to see if we could make these records useful. And then flash forward to 2019, we launched the first phase of the project by publishing the data sets and creating a companion website that uses data visualization to tell new stories. But we didn't stop there. We thought, why stop at the postal records when we have all of Franklin Shop's books at our disposal, literally like right downstairs from my office. So these books, as you can see here, are full of super rich data. So over the past several years, all the shop books were meticulously transcribed, the data was cleaned, the data sets were released to the public, and a series of new visualizations interrogate the data, showing potential users new uses. But there's always more to do. And we thought it'd be really cool to push it even further to try to tie all the account books, postal, shop, all together into one massive data set. This would, in theory, allow users the ability to search through all of Franklin shop books simultaneously. But making the data interoperable and creating a structure that will allow different data sets to speak to one another in a meaningful way is tedious work and at times super, super frustrating, more so for my colleagues in the audience than for me. But that work paid off, and I'm pleased to say that we actually did it. So what you see here, it's not live yet, but I want to give you a sneak peek at what's to come in October. We're going to launch this in conjunction with the 300th anniversary of Franklin coming to Philadelphia. This is a Franklin Ledgers database. One of the first steps to making this database a reality was to create unique identifiers for every single person that shows up in the Franklin Ledgers postal shop books. As you can see here, there are now approximately 4,500 unique names in the account books. What this means is that you can click on any individual's name in the database and bring up their entire account. This allows you to see everything they purchased, every piece of mail they received, any advertisement they posted in the Gazette throughout sort of right now like a 10-year period. We also created controlled vocabularies for all the different goods sold at the shop. This offers users a better sense of the varied material moving in and out of the shop. For example, if you wanted to know how many Bibles were sold by the Franklins and who was buying them, look no further. You can just go right here. So, what's that? I do want to know that. Yeah, see, it's great. Yeah, already new uses. But really, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, we're still refining it. We're going to do user testing, but look for a big launch coming in October. But as I said in the beginning, I'm not a documentary editor, but I think there's a lot of overlap between the work that we do at the Center for Digital Scholarship and the work of documentary editing. Especially that our end goal is super common. It's to produce enhanced access to the documentary record. I'll leave it at that so we can have time for conversation, but thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. I already have 3 emails to send, one to each of you to ask for advance info. So I think I just want to mention a couple quick things before we go to questions, I think straight to the audience discussion. I think what we've heard today is something that is pretty regular when we think about infrastructure and we think about the kind of technical and interpretive work that these projects do. First is we often get introduced to new cool stuff. Like that happened all along here, right? We're like, ooh, wow, okay, that's neat. The second is that there's so much here that is recognizable, I think, to every person in this room, no matter where we are situated in the world of seeking early America. One is no historical importance. Okay, we all know that one, right? Interdisciplinarity, collaboration. Good heavens, collaboration, the centrality of collaboration, but even the technical things that may seem remote to us, like controlled vocabularies and linked data and metadata and open access. All of these things are things that have been embedded in early American scholarship and in its infrastructure for decades now. I wanted to throw out a couple of contexts for maybe possibly conversation, but I'm sure you all have better ideas, but I'm just going to throw a couple out. One is the kind of only murders in the building question, which is about the puzzle pieces and which puzzle pieces we're seeing and which we're not. That is, if we're only putting together the pieces that we have, that is, if we're only putting together the pieces that Jefferson's papers offer us, what are the pieces that we're missing? And are we always thinking about, in fact, that there is a very big picture of which we only have a few pieces? And this goes exactly to the points that the first panel was making. Secondly, the question of how can we historicize this infrastructural work of early American scholarship? That is, can we think about the history of early American history and its relationship to why and how those big flagship projects got funded and how they may be less funded, let's just say, in the future. And then thirdly, can we futurecast a bit and talk about the needs and opportunities in infrastructure, going back to these recognizable necessities of interdisciplinarity, collaboration, and paying attention to the things that have no historical importance. So, having said, I would love to have questions from the audience. I see lots. I see right over there. Excellent.
Thank you so much. I mostly wanted to respond to Bayard, the presentation of the materials here at the APS. First of all, thank you. I spent a lot of time with the shop books during the pandemic shutdown, and they were wonderful company. Second, and going back to the first panel this morning, I really hope all of this is described as the Franklins. It seemed inconsistent, or there was a mix of approaches. And Deborah Franklin is really instrumental to keeping all of those businesses alive. She keeps a lot of those records. So I think that would be a good kind of statement to be made about the project. And third, a very selfish question. There are entries in the shop books for My Madman. Did anyone ever figure out who that was? It's in Deborah, she issues credit to somebody described as My Madman. Possibly a private joke about the guy she married, I don't know. But it raises another question of, in all those names, have you checked who these people are? Not only the madman, though I'm sort of curious about who he or she might have been. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joyce. I think the first thing to discuss is the Deb situation. Deborah, sorry. Okay. Deborah is a huge part of this project going forward. We started with the postal ledgers, and then when Bethany came on board, really dove into the shop books, the account books, and really got into deciphering whose handwriting is who, and then realizing, a lot of this is Deborah's. A lot of this work is Deborah's. So what we do with all of our data sets that we put out there, we don't just put them out there, we like to build companion sites that sort of dive into these things. So we have a whole section on Deborah and her work within the account books at the shop and how instrumental she was in that. The madman, I don't know. I'm looking. No, yeah. So no, David's saying no. Maybe not Benjamin Franklin. I don't know. He was sort of a madman, right? And then the fourth question, looking into the other folks in there, yeah, that's sort of the fun part of this, is finding the people that you don't know about and sort of seeing who they finding them, isolating them in the database, seeing all the stuff they buy, all the stuff they send out, things that they've advertised in the Gazette. That's really interesting. But you can really pull out these names. You have no idea what they are. For example, in the postal books, we all got obsessed, and some of you may have heard this before, a gentleman named William Vanderspiegel, who none of us knew who he was, but at the end of the Franklin's tenure in the post office, Vanderspiegel owed him a lot of money, a significant amount of money, but we didn't know who he was. So it's all sorts of questions like that come out of this data that, again, like 1961, they say this data is useless, basically, but in that form it was, but now we're proving that it's not. So there's a lot of stories that we can tell with this data. So in October, we're going to launch the database and hope that other folks will use it, but we're going to, on this companion website, we're going to tell a lot of the different stories that we found sort of going through the project. So.
Hi, thanks very much for your comments. And in keeping with Karen's theme of infrastructure, I wonder if you could talk about the role that you see in the future of documentary editing as it relates to digital tools to perform at least a first draft of manuscript transcription, a tool like Transcribus, or even data text extraction that could help expedite, but not entirely produce the kind of refined draft that you would see in the Franklin Ledger books.
ChatGPT has entered the building.
You're the tech guy.
I guess I'm the tech guy.
Hey, you said you're not a documentary editor, so you get all the other questions.
I'm not, but so we haven't really dove into that quite yet. We've done, I'll say, two things. With a lot of the data we work with, because it's human beings, we want to take great care to go into that. And when we're creating the data sets, we don't want to just send algorithms in there to pull out data like that. That being said, David over the summer, Maeve Kane, she was brought up earlier today. She came and David was building out Python scripts so that we could go in make PDFs of all these baptismal records, and then they seem like they're structured on the page, but it's really hard to get that structure out. So we put out scripts for that, so you can go in there and then create structured data sets out of that. But the chat GPT stuff, I'm not really excited about it, but yeah, here you go.
I keep forgetting there are multiple mics. I think that's a really interesting question, and the evolution of my data set has been something that really brought that to my attention. As they exist on ancestry.org or .com, most of the time it's difficult to realize that you can go in and open up the ledgers themselves. They have a front-facing search mechanism, and so you go in and just like any other genealogical research, you plug in names and places and dates and hope you find something. But that relies entirely on OCR, and so you're trusting computer recognition for these things. And even when I started just going through, I realized very quickly that it was not reliable and it wasn't picking up particular things. My father works a little bit with artificial intelligence in his job, and one of his favorite things to say is that artificial intelligence is only as smart as the person programming it. And even with ChatGPT, I think a lot of what has been discussed kind of broadly amongst academics and in the media is that these chatbots can hallucinate information, right? They pull false information. They can, and they can only really work with what they have. Whereas we don't maybe learn quite as quickly sometimes as them in certain circumstances, but we do have our past selves to look at. So when I first started putting my database together, I was approaching it as a straightforward transcription. And originally I was going to show you the first pages that I transcribed, and then I realized that I didn't realize that I needed extracted and imputed fields until about 10 pages in, when I started being curious about that information. And so that's something that still needs to go back and be cleaned up. But I think it comes down to actually being very intentional about the production of these works, and sitting down at the outset and thinking about what you want to get out of them and what other people might need to get from them in the future. Because I think that's one of the things that for me, many of these data sets have been so inaccessible, and the great value of the edited editions is that not only are they transcribing the documents, but they're providing the context, and they're extracting the things that you might need to know and creating linkages between documents. And so while artificial intelligence may be able to do some of this, I don't think that they can do the same kind of processing about what we as historians need as individuals, or what future historians might find of value. And I think that's where we get the no historical value kind of statements early on, is that you have a limited amount of time and energy, and you can't deal with all of those tiny pieces of data. And eventually maybe we'll get ChatGPT to be able to deal with it, but as of now, I'm still not trusting OCR.
Can I just add one quick thing in response to Jim's excellent question, which is that in the spirit of crowdsourcing, it would be great, I don't know, maybe there is somebody has already crowdsourced, what are the number of early American, capaciously conceived? What are the projects that are using Transkribus or another LLM or another trained language model? I would like to know. I mean, I know what our experience was in the Georgian Papers program with Transkribus, but I don't know what the other ones are, and that would be a great kind of collective source to have.
If I just on the question of infrastructure and on this kind of issue, this points out that Bayard's Digital Scholarship Center here, there's a built-in infrastructure that's addressing a lot of these issues overall that can then be applied in some of these specific cases. You have to have something like that. And so an awful lot of these endeavors going forward, they're not going to be just sort of a startup where some scholar somewhere says, oh, I want to do this thing with these ledger books. you're going to have to find someone that's going to be like at a digital humanities center or some sort of project where these things are already going, these questions are being addressed, and they're getting at these kinds of things. And you know, you need, it also gives you a sort of standing infrastructure for the staff and the people you need to go forward and do a project like this as part of the larger endeavor. The meteorological records, the Jefferson meteorological records would be almost impossible to do as just sort of a standalone startup sort of project. But what we were able to do was combine forces with the Center for Digital Editing down at UVA, who are experienced documentary editors as well as knowing the technology. And we were in conversation with Bayard and his group from the beginning, knowing that we wanted to go with go for a larger project also that would aggregate weather and climate records from many sources. You could do that as sort of an add-on for the Jefferson papers, able to do it without having to sort of like get special funding just for that and go forward and get that completed and move along. It's very difficult for a grad student to be able to pull off something like that. There is a technological and a knowledge infrastructure that we have to keep working on ways and developing ways to tap into that to make that a benefit to allow projects to go forward.
So I have an initial comment on artificial intelligence before I make the comment I was intending to make. But on ChatGPT, people here may be interested in the fact that I decided just for fun to ask GPT about women in the American Revolution. And it proceeded to tell me that Esther de Burt Reed was a loyalist. And it proceeded to make up a completely fake pamphlet by a woman called, get this, A Series of Letters was the title of the fake pamphlet by a woman named Anna Campbell. And so that was completely made up. There was the usual other stuff, not particularly interesting. But that's just on the light of artificial intelligence. Do not trust it on the subject of the first panel this morning. But I wanted, in the context of infrastructure and documentary editing, the comment I wanted to make had to do with the fact that in the really old days, before the, quote, comprehensive editions, the initial editions of the Washington, Jefferson, etc. papers were the letters written by that person, but not the letters that were coming in. And to my knowledge, the only important, quote unquote, great white man involved in the founding of the United States that has not been fixed in that regard is Samuel Adams. The Samuel Adams papers are all the old style, only Samuel Adams writings, not even very many of his letters, mostly of essays that he wrote in newspapers. Absolutely none of the incoming letters have ever been published. You have to go to the New York Public Library to read them in manuscript, which I did. But I want to put out a plea. If there's anybody here who wants to make a proposal for a big new editing project, think of the Samuel Adams papers.
All right. So I think we have time for one more question, and I will give it here.
Hi, thanks. Following on Deborah's Madman and Karen's call for collaboration and crowdsourcing, I'm curious, Bayard, if there will be sufficiently or any interactive capacity in the site to allow people to either moderate it or not, offer their ideas, understanding, or even answers to these questions. Just on the theory that it may be that a graduate student doesn't have the infrastructure to do a whole project like this on his or her own, but what if they've been deeply researching Deborah's Madman and they have something to say about it? Will there be the capacity to have added information? And then related to that is sort of a proprietary question, which is to what extent will other archives be able to participate with the project in the sense that they might have complementary manuscripts, materials that could, again, offer additional context to kind of wrap around the ledgers.
Those are great questions. We think about them all the time. To the first one, yes. Our biggest problem with the Open Data Initiative is that we put the data out there, and we think people are using it, but no one ever tells us how they're using it. So we want to create some sort of mechanism where people can give us feedback, can contribute their projects. But yes, it's a great idea to have some space, like on the complimentary website where people can show what they've done with the data, put an essay out there. Like, I think that's great to engage the community like that. And then two, yes, that's what we want. So especially with these, so I have this grand theory that if we can continue to come up with these unique identifiers and continue adding to that list, then we can reach out to other archives that have similar data, and those people show up in their data sets. Then we put those unique identifiers there, and then they can just contribute to this larger database. So I think that would be great. So I think that's the hope. In October, once we get it out there, we can hit the road. We can start talking to people about how they can contribute to it, because I think it's going to be a really good resource. So yes and yes.
So I think we are just exactly at time. I wanted to take 10 more seconds just to say, Barbara, you're amazing. And I don't think we can. I don't think we can wrap this session without at least mentioning the one documentary edition of a Philadelphia 18th century woman, Elaine Crane's incredible edition of the Diaries of Elizabeth Drinker. And I will take my answer offline, which is a question about how much of those unique identifiers did you rely on the extensive biographical dictionary in the Drinker Diaries, which were really incredible. Anyway, thank you all so much, and I look forward to talking to you.